Good evening. Welcome to the second in the series of webinars on drugs and the law presented by the Drug Advisory Council of Australia. My name is Jan Kronberg and I'm the National President of the Drug Advisory Council of Australia. And with me is former Assistant Commissioner of Police Noel Ashby, APM, and he is our guest speaker for tonight. Before we move to Noel's presentation, there are a few things I'd like to highlight for you. First and foremost, thank you very much for going out of your way to attend this event, the second in our webinar series, and we'll be talking later in the evening about the third one. As people register for this event, people make donations to help us in our work, and we're really appreciative of those donations that we've received. And through the course of this evening, you'll be able to see the means and the link where you could make a donation if you haven't already done so. So thank you very much in anticipation of that gesture, and thank you for those who have already made a donation. We have a huge workload, and the Drug Advisory Council is a body made up entirely of volunteers. So we're doing this work on behalf of the community, and we're reaching out across this country. Now tonight I'm very pleased to advise you all that as you join in your own place with us tonight, we have people from right around Australia, as far west as Western Australia itself, and through to Tasmania, South Australia, New South Wales, the length and breadth of Victoria, and into Queensland, so right up through Queensland. So we just love this opportunity of covering the nation as we do. Now, the Drug Advisory Council has been busy in making a number of strategic moves, and one of those is reflected in the Touchstone logo that you see behind me as I speak to you. Touchstone is a unit that we've developed last year, and it's meant entirely for providing support and counselling for the families and parents of the drug affected, those who are grieving, for those who have been lost for a variety of ways. They've been lost to drugs and have come through drug taking, but it's been very disturbing for the family. And right through the work of the Drug Advisory Council, we place the emphasis on the individual. We hope to provide enough information and education through our endeavours in reaching young people to prevent them from taking drugs in the first place, but then dealing with the realities and for those who've been left behind, and for those who've been directly affected emotionally, physically and financially, and all of the disruption that this creates on families and society. It's a very big task, and whatever you do by way of your support to help us in this work, we're really grateful for. So tonight I would like to make mention of some of our special people who are in attendance. Firstly, as I said, we had a wide audience, but we also have Bronwyn Bishop, the Honourable Bronwyn Bishop, former Speaker of the House of Representatives. We have Dr. Alexander Callis, we have Rabbi Dr. Shimon Cohen, and we have the co-founder of the Drug Advisory Council over 20 years ago, Elaine Walters, OAM. I'd like to give thanks to our technical support person tonight, Gabriel Tipness, who we love working with Gabriel on all matters to do with technical and IT and the broadcasting. We're able to use his facility, so it's a dedicated studio environment, and it just gives us a little bit more of a professional edge for you tonight. There's a lot of material to cover, and Noel has presented a great degree of information for you tonight, but he's going to present it obviously in digestible lumps for you. I want to send out special greetings to those people who would be celebrating the Chinese New Year at this moment, the Year of the Tiger. So I wish you good health and prosperity for the Year of the Tiger. Now, without further ado, I'd like to move to a formal introduction establishing Noel's credentials. Many of you will remember the breadth of his experience in 35 years in Victoria Police, and as somebody who's offered up so much of his adult life to community service as a police officer. So we commend him for that, and we thank him for that, as we thank all of those in those first responder roles around the nation. Noel rose to the rank of Assistant Commissioner and was awarded the Australian Police Medal, the APM, for conspicuous service in policing in Victoria and also in Australia. Noel was officially commended at force level on 5 occasions for operational leadership of police investigations relating to the investigation of individuals committing major crimes, with 2 of those commendations relating to work performance and leadership, in particular in drug law enforcement. Noel was a member of the Homicide Squad in Victoria for 6 years, and he investigated many high-profile murders, including drug-related homicide and the murders of police officers. He was a former officer in charge of the investigation group that investigated major and fatal car crashes involving criminal negligence, including drug-related car crashes. Prior to being appointed as Assistant Commissioner, he was formerly the Divisional Commander of the Serious Crime Division Crime Department. The strategic interests of the Homicide Squad, the Missing Persons Unit, the Special Response Squad, the Prison Squad, the Rape Squad, and the Child Exploitation Squad. As Commissioner, Noel was responsible for education and training, including detective training, the South East region in Victoria for all police arrangements in Melbourne's inner southern suburbs, to the New South Wales border, including Hills, the Victorian coastlines and towns. He was also the Assistant Commissioner for Road Policing and Public Transport Safety. So when it comes to talking about drugs and driving on Australian roads, and his focus of course has been in Victoria, what better person could we draw upon in terms of expertise and depth of experience? So I'm now very, very pleased to hand the floor over to Noel. Noel, please.
Thanks, Jan, and thanks again for your kind introduction. It's much appreciated. It sounds a little bit better than it seemed at the time, Jan. But, nevertheless, I am enduringly proud of that time with Victoria Police, which is a great organisation and one that I was honoured to serve. Our previous webinar was on the 23rd of November last year, and that was on street level drug enforcement and what it was like and how it worked at the street level. Tonight we've moved into the next stage perhaps, and as Jan said, later on we'll be moving further into transnational related crimes, etc. But this was an emerging trend, drugs and driving, that has really grown in the last 25 or so years. So in outlining my presentation tonight, I'll first speak about some historical perspectives, and it's important to understand some of those historical perspectives and the synergy or tension, if you like, often between drink driving and drugs and driving. But there are, I might say, some striking similarities. I'll also talk specifically about drugs and driving itself, about some of the issues that occur and are confronted, and also some of the specific issues about driving under the influence, etc., in regards to drugs. And in fact, this evening, one of our members of the Touchstone Committee contacted me, Peter Richardson, and gave me an example this week on a Melbourne freeway that he witnessed of a drug driver who fortunately didn't kill or seriously injure someone. And of course, Peter is a former member of Victoria Police also. I'd also like to touch on statistics. Now, statistics are important, but these are facts and reporting statistics. I'm just touching on them briefly, and on the various websites available through VicRoads, TAC, Department of Justice in Victoria and Victoria Police, there is much information, and indeed nationally there is considerable information available, but there's some key statistics that need to be just put in front of the audience for the audience to think about as they relate to drugs and driving. And in conclusion, I'll then pose just perhaps a couple of questions for the audience to think about, and for indeed broader Australians, and certainly here in Victoria, Victorians. So let's go to the historical perspectives. Talking about drink driving and drug driving, there are two key offences that are committed by people who drink and drive, drink alcohol and drive, or use drugs and drive. There are other offences for sure that are available to the law enforcement authorities, but there are two key ones that we'll deal with tonight for the sake of simplicity, and they're really the offences of, in the alcohol sense, which most people will have heard about it, it's exceed the prescribed concentration of alcohol, or exceed 0.05. And the second one is drive under the influence of alcohol. They're two different offences, and it's often not well known that that's the case. But XPCA, so exceed 0.05, is when a driver is detected driving or having driven a car on a highway or a public place where there's the presence of alcohol in their system that exceeds 0.05%. There's no requirement under that offence for a driver to be impaired or to have any form of being under the influence of the alcohol. The second offence is drive under the influence of alcohol. That's exactly the same circumstances that I've outlined, with the exception that the driver must display signs of impairment, and quite often that is a direct danger to the public that's demonstrated. A lot of people will historically know the physical tests that used to be undertaken for people that had been detected drink driving to determine whether they were DUI. Now, and in the last 20 years, we've leveraged off medical evidence in a far greater way than we could have envisaged, with alcohol countbacks, etc., and physiological factors in people's behaviour. And there's a range of issues now that science and medicine, forensic medicine, can assist with. So what about drugs and driving? The issue with that is that the offences are similar. The current legislation in Victoria in terms of drugs and driving means a driver can be detected driving on the road through a booze bus, intercepted by police, or in any circumstances where they may come into contact with police, undergo a drug test, which is a saliva test, and the presence principally of 3 drugs or derivatives thereof, of those drugs, are present. And that's THC, so tetrahydrocannabinol, MDMA or ecstasy, and also methamphetamine, and the range of drugs that fall around those type of drugs. You might properly ask, what about other drugs? If the police suspect other drugs, they can reasonably ask someone to undergo a blood test, and there's a legal process to do that. But let's just deal for the moment just with what we're talking about with the roadside drug testing, and that's the drug testing that I introduced as an Assistant Commissioner in Victoria Police in the late 2000s, and we were the first jurisdiction in Australia, well indeed the world, I might say, in Australia, to do so on a mass basis. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But the fact is, if you're detected with either of those substances in your saliva, the offence is complete. There is no need for an impairment factor. Again, similar to drink driving. There's another offence, that follows, and it's similar to drink driving, and it's DUI drugs, driving under the influence of drugs. Now, this isn't a recent crime. This has been a crime that's existed for the whole time that I was a member of Victoria Police, from the 70s onwards, late 70s onwards. So it's a historical crime. It's a crime that can be proven through the use of illicit drugs, but also importantly, prescription drugs can contribute as well, and contributes in many, many ways. So it's not limited by any stretch. It just means if you're driving a motor car and unable to have proper control of the car, or under the influence to the extent that you're a danger to others, then the offence of DUI drugs is made out. Just in talking about the tension between alcohol and drugs, it's never been a crime to possess alcohol, use alcohol. But alcohol is only legal and to a point. And that point is crossed when certain actions by an individual are undertaken. Now, historically, there was crimes of drunk and disorderly, drunk in a public place, where the police had come along in the divan and arrest someone who was a danger to themselves or a danger to others, and drop them in the cells of a local police station for usually 4 hours so they could sober and be released. And quite often they'd be charged with drunk and disorderly and convicted and discharged, or they'd be discharged without conviction. So it was really more of a procedural thing. That's now been removed, repealed by the Victorian government, and there's sobering centres being set up where drunken people can be taken to those and dropped in until they sober up. Essentially, it's the same process in many ways, except it takes police very much away from the management of a person, which is in many ways can be a good thing. But historically, there's also been other offences, and some people may be surprised, but it gives you some insight as to the crimes that were committed using alcohol. So again, it demonstrates clearly only to a point was alcohol legal, and that was drunk in charge of a bicycle, drunk in charge of a horse, drunk in charge of a carriage. These are historical offences that existed until fairly recently in the statute books. So alcohol has always been legal, but as I say, to that point. Of course, the other thing with alcohol is the violence that is often seen that lead to shocking assaults in the community, social dysfunction in the community, and also tragically and sadly as a major contributory factor, and I saw this on many occasions as an operational policeman, and also sadly in the homicide squad, in family violence matters where shocking crimes were committed. Drugs of dependence have always been a crime, always been an indictable offence in Victoria under the Drugs, Poisons and Controlled Substances Act to possess drugs of dependence, traffic in drugs of dependence, import drugs of dependence, and perhaps as an anomaly, it was a summary offence, but still an offence within the Drugs, Poisons and Controlled Substances Act for using drugs of dependence. They've never been legal in Australia, never been legal certainly in Victoria. So that brings us then to drugs and driving specifically. As I mentioned, DUI drugs has always been a crime. DUI drugs is also one of the major contributory factors to the most serious criminal charges emanating from car crashes that occurs, and that is culpable driving causing death, dangerous driving causing death, and the offences of serious injuries that occur to people as a consequence of driving motor vehicles when people have had drugs in their system. More and more, it's been the illicit drugs rather than the prescription drugs, but nevertheless, it has been in the statute books and a key part of Victorian criminal process for decades. So DUI drugs has been around for a long time. In 2008, after much work and after working for a considerable time in the Major Collision Investigation Group and as the officer in charge of that group, where we implemented a series of major reforms dealing directly with investigation of drugs and drug-related crashes, the government enacted the present legislation for drugs and driving. The legislation allows drug buses in combination with booze buses, independent police operating separately in those circumstances to stop people randomly on the highway or on a street or anywhere in a public place and test them by a prescribed saliva test. As I said, this is a non-DUI offence. The people that are charged with that are detected with the drugs, the three principal drugs I mentioned in their system, face on-the-spot fines and banned from driving, and they also must undergo a course of awareness before they can become re-licensed and start to drive. So the three drugs is the THC, as I mentioned, methamphetamine and MDMA. And as I said earlier, police can and do, if they suspect the presence of other drugs, require a person to undergo a full blood test, and it's a crime for the person to refuse that blood test. It's also equally a crime to have the blood test and a test positive. When we started in 2007 and 2008 with the random drug testing in Victoria, we targeted 25,000 drivers annually in Victoria, and that was deemed to be a considerable figure. And looking back then, it was. To the great credit of Tasmania in Australia, the Tasmanian state were already doing random tests for drugs, but they were doing it spontaneously and not on a mass basis. And the extent that Victoria, at that point, no doubt led the world. We transported this technology and the processes to other nations in the world, where it's now become quite common. So there's no doubt in Victoria at that time, Victoria was leading the world in terms of that legislation. And hopefully they continue to lead the world in terms of looking at solutions for drugs and driving. So what about the facts and the reporting and some statistics? Firstly, in terms of drugs and the drugs we've mentioned, drugs stay in a person's system for a considerably longer period of time than does alcohol. Now, physiological factors will determine much of this, and it'll depend on the individual concerned and their metabolism. So there's a lot of medicine and forensic medicine that needs to be considered in regards to that. But there has been recorded cases where people had used one of the three prescribed drugs that I just mentioned, so THC, MDMA, methamphetamine and its derivatives, up to 10 days later being stopped by police and testing positive because the residual effects and substances of the drugs are still in their system. And perhaps some of us will remember the ad recently on television. And it's a story of a young fellow. It's quite a good advertisement here in Victoria that I've seen. A young fellow and the ad says you can be tested anywhere in Victoria. So be careful where you drive, you can be tested. And it's a young fellow who picks up his grandmother. And his grandmother is in the car, a typical grandmum, and being driven by her grandson. And he gets stopped and he tests positive in the presence of his grandmother. Now it's a powerful message because the message was he wasn't impaired at the time by drugs, but he had been using drugs and drugs were found in his system and he was driving a car and he was then held to account and charged. Now what I didn't like about that ad was the police left the grandmum sitting in the car, which wouldn't have, and as they drove away, which wouldn't have been the best thing to do. But in any event, the message was about the drugs and driving. So that is just merely the presence of the drug in the system. Statistics recently show, and these statistics don't lie, these are statistics from post-mortem examination of drivers who have, and riders of motorcycles who have been killed on Victorian roads. 41% of Victorian drivers killed on roads have the presence of drugs in their system. 41%. That is considerable. Now, you have to factor in also the point that I just made. The presence of drugs stays in the system for a period of time. Alcohol stays in the system 6 to 12 hours, and which isn't an extended time compared to drugs. But nevertheless, 41% of drivers killed on our roads have been using one of the 3 prescribed drugs largely that we're talking about. Of those, 19.3% were stimulant drugs, so amphetamine-related drugs, meth drugs that had been in people's system, and 10.3 of those were cannabis. And of course, the one thing I should mention, the cannabis, the THC is the active constituent of cannabis. That's the constituent that impairs drivers. That is the constituent that impairs people's behaviour. It affects their motor skills. It affects their judgment. So it's measuring the factor. It's measuring the factor of the drug that did impair people's behaviour. Not to say they were impaired at the time, otherwise they'd be charged with DUI, drive under the influence of drugs. But it still shows that is a considerable figure, 41%. The same sample shows 1 in 5 drivers killed on the roads exceeded 0.05. So when you have a look at the causal factors for fatal and major injury car crashes in Victoria, it's absolutely a no-brainer. Drugs and alcohol are at the front. They are leading the charge. There's no accidents here. This isn't someone who did something by accident. This is something they did intentionally and took a risk and killed themselves, could have killed others, or also could easily have created life-threatening injuries for people for the rest of their lives. The time of which people are killed and injured on our roads has been analysed, and statistics show that alcohol is a drug and a factor in is a factor in car crashes, fatal car crashes, usually in later hours, so after hours. It clearly indicates it's being used irresponsibly but socially. MDMA, methamphetamine, THC, or the delta-9, the active constituent, there's no particular time. The presence of these drugs occurs all the time, which indicates a significant risk to people using the roads all the time, not just in the evening. The roads are always dangerous. Everyone knows that from kindergarten on. But when you think of the growth and the advent of drugs, it's a 24/7 drug on the roads. It's a 24/7 drug, and there are a lot of people that are driving at different times impaired. And as I mentioned earlier, a friend and colleague, Peter Richardson, from our group, who observed the behaviour of someone recently on a major Melbourne freeway, that was in the broad daylight. And I only learned of this 15 minutes before going to air this evening. So there's no doubt about it. By any standards, drugs are and have emerged and are continuing to emerge and play a part as a major causal factor in collisions across the state, across Australia, and across the world. There is no doubt about that. And the thing that we haven't touched on as much up to now is the major injuries. The major injuries and injury crashes for drug-affected drivers are 20-fold. So for every person who dies, 20 people are suffering major injuries, life-threatening injuries, injuries that change people's lives and cause ongoing trauma for families and management into the future. And if you look at the economic effects, in 2006, I went to Israel at the guest of the Israeli government to talk about the road toll and drugs and driving. And Israel, as a sovereign nation, was looking to reduce road trauma and the expense economically of road trauma, not only socially and personally, but economically, so they could dedicate additional funds to the welfare and well-being of the state on a whole range of other issues that Israel particularly faces. So there is an economic effect, a huge economic effect. And we used to say, back when I was in the Major Collision Investigation Group and also as the Assistant Commissioner for Road Policing, used to be that in a purely economic sense, it costs the community a profoundly expensive, greater sum to provide ongoing medical help and assistance and support for someone who's a quadriplegic or a paraplegic or have acquired brain injuries for the rest of their lives, before the tragedy that we deal with, which should always be first and foremost in our minds. So it brings us to a couple of questions here. Firstly, there's debate around, is the legalisation of drugs appropriate? Is it? And how do we manage it in the light of what we're seeing with the growth of drugs and driving in society? And is it time to consider other enforcement options? And it wasn't all that long ago, and I made the point to Jan in a conversation some time ago, it wasn't all that long ago in Victoria particularly, we used to be able to stop people and have roadblocks on the highway for fruit fly. We don't do that for drugs, and I wonder why. Because while fruit fly was a terrible disease for farmers throughout Australia indeed, but certainly the food belt of Victoria, I don't know too many people that died from it in the sense of injuries that were caused. So is there other options we can do? And it's a question to be posed, to build in to the enforcement regime that we have. And ultimately, is the time right to legalise drugs in that sense, as some are claiming? So Jan, I'll just conclude on that note, and I'll pass back to you for any questions that people may have, and I hope I haven't taken too much of the time, but thanks again, and I look forward to taking some questions.
Noel, thank you so much, and it's terrific that you've provided such a high quality and intense briefing for everybody tonight. There's a lot of information to absorb, and I just want to underpin what's available to people. If you would like to see others share our information tonight, it is going to be available on YouTube. So it's something that you can invite others and disseminate the recording of this session tonight. And some of the material that the Drug Advisory Council does through its webinars finds its way converted for publication in one of the finest current affairs magazines in this country, News Weekly, and that material will be available in due course through that publication as well. It's really important that these webinars and this information is disseminated, and I hope that you take it upon yourselves to actually make sure others who need to know, and that's pretty much everybody, grandparents right through to children just in their final years of primary school and right through the secondary experience. And we need to appreciate, I'd just like to make a couple of points in terms of the really big dangers out there with the new school year starting. You must be alert to what's going on with young people adopting vaping. It's proposed as a means of getting people to give up smoking tobacco. It's actually meant to be a major alternative delivery system of drugs, and they're flavoured and they're disguised in many ways, and you might be surprised to find what's in a 13-year-old's pencil case. It could look like a USB, and you might find that it's one of the components of a vaping device. So this is a new frontier for you all to be alert about, and there's a lot of information on the Drug Advisory Council's website, and I'd like to draw your attention to our website and encourage you to visit that, and that's www.daca.org.au. There's a lot of information there for you, and we'd love you to take on board that material that's published and updated on a regular basis. And now to the host of questions that have come through. Thank you for all of those who have sent questions through, and there's such a lot. I think we have to be mindful, Noel, of perhaps giving a shorter answer so that we can have wider coverage.
Yeah, I've been known to waffle, Jan, so I'll cut to the chase.
I'm not suggesting you're waffling, but I'm just saying there's a lot here to cover.
No, that's fine.
And this one is from Sarah Elizabeth. How has the demography of drug driving offenders changed in the past 30 years? And what part can social media play in promoting a positive message? Thank you, Sarah Elizabeth.
There's two parts to Sarah Elizabeth's question. I think the first part is that street drugs, as we spoke at the last webinar, was traditionally dealing with young people. Those the young people that have survived that period and are still with us, and many of them are still drug addicted. But we're seeing now a greater maturity of people who are being detected driving with drugs in their system. And so we're seeing, as society ages, if that's the right word, that there is a increasing of the age as to what we had perhaps 20 years ago of those that are being detected and those that are offending. Although it is still across the board. It is not isolated by any stretch, but it is just across the board. Social media, for the second part of Sarah Elizabeth's question, is critical, absolutely critical, the various aspects of social media. Now, some people aren't on social media, so there's a need to think about those messages too through the broader media. But social media is important, and it needs to be exploited in the full range of areas for information, real information to get out. Historically, messages about law enforcement and for road safety have always done exceptionally well and been received exceptionally well when they're based on facts. And there's no better forum at the moment than the various and the many social media forums that exist to get some of those messages out. But the important thing is to share the truth with them, the real numbers and the real victims. And in that sense, if that can be focused on, not only by DACA, but more broadly others, then everyone will just make that little bit more of a difference.
Noel, thank you very much. The next question comes from Karen. In 2104, the World Health Organization reported that alcohol kills one person every 10 seconds worldwide. If this is a result with a legal substance, how could legalising drugs possibly help?
Speaks for itself, Karen. Far be it from me to enter into the science. That needs no science at all. That's what you'd regard as a no-brainer. And it also, again, demonstrates perhaps what I touched on in my comments earlier, that alcohol has been legal to a point, and that's where it starts and that's where it ends. But to legalise more broadly drugs in that context would be a serious social issue that needs to be properly ventilated and not glibly covered or presented. Let's get to the real facts, and let's put the real facts out there, and let's let the community have their say.
Thank you, Noel. This question is from Josephine in South Australia. How possible and practical is testing for impairment with all the different drugs in existence and more appearing all the time?
The main thing, I guess, from that is that there is the derivatives of the drugs, and you can be guaranteed, and we'll perhaps touch on this a little bit at the next webinar, and it's an important point because drugs, as they develop in many other areas and are reproduced and reinvented, pose a real threat, not only to law enforcement but also to border protection in identifying them. Medically, the forensic scientists and forensic physicians can identify the presence of drugs in the individual through a range of physical factors, quite that the ordinary people can't see. In other words, in the eyes and certain behavioural aspects. But more broadly, as drugs evolve, it follows that cartels would surely try to mask some of these effects. So this is a matter for agility. This is a matter for science to continue to analyse and attack, and for law enforcement to share that information through the justice forums. Without the agility to focus on the shifting nature of drugs, law enforcement will fail. But for the moment, it hasn't failed in the sense of it hasn't been defeated in terms of identifying new trends, new drugs, new substances, and has generally responded as well as it could in all of the circumstances. It's not to say it can't do better, but this is a matter of a whole of society approach, from science through to the community, through to government, through to private industry, through all the way back to the individual.
Noel, thank you very much. The next question is from Catherine in Mildura. What role, if any, do police hold in having a drug-affected person directed into a drug rehabilitation centre?
Yeah, normally police, Catherine, are involved in pretty much the detection, the investigation along the way, presenting to court. Clearly, the prosecution, whether it's a more serious prosecution and the Crown is represented by the Director of Public Prosecutions, or whether it's a police prosecution, the prosecution is consulted about diversion programs, rehabilitation clinics for individuals, and that's really important. So at the outset, when police are preparing detailed documents for presentation to the court in the form of a brief of evidence, those issues are directly addressed, as they should be, because if there is a chance for reasonable rehabilitation for anyone, that's something that should be considered. That's something that should always be thought about, because rehabilitation really is the basis of our criminal justice system and our incarceration system. It is about rehabilitation, contrary to what some people may believe. So the police, like the other partners who are involved in the administration of criminal justice, have a critical role in that, and they should all regard that seriously, and they should all regard that only in the interests of the community, and only in the interests then of the offender having a reasonable opportunity for rehabilitation.
Thank you, Noel. The next question is from Alexander in Summers. The rise is disturbing and dangerous. The cause of this trend appears to be socio-economic and outside of policing duties. Broader exposure of this problem is essential. Input from large corporations would increase public awareness. Penalties are not severe enough to draw public attention. Trends towards legalisation of drugs is the biggest obstacle towards serious reform, and this has become a monumental obstruction to cleaning up this dangerous trend. The medical profession does not have clean hands. As a taxpayer-funded enterprise, they need to be recruited for serious help. That's a big one for you, Noel.
Yes, it is a big one. There's a common trend that runs through it, and it's touched on something that we've already said as well. It's the involvement of the community, the involvement of all parties, and it is not, and no single party should be exempt. So the courts should not be exempt from their roles. Private industry should be encouraged, with perhaps even for a government to think about tax deductions for assisting in getting the message and contributing to rehabilitation of drugs. It's a whole of community involvement. It's political, it's the executive, it's the legislature, and it's private industry. And then it gets down to groups and charities and groups such as the Drug Advisory Council of Australia to all have a role in it and make sure that they are heard in that. And the community has to listen holistically. It is not purely, and has never been purely, a policing issue, and nor should it be. It is a whole of community effort that is the only way will make any sustainable, meaningful inroads into reducing the trauma caused by drugs to families, to the community, and to individuals. So the point being made is absolutely correct, with the extent that it does need a holistic approach. Without it, not going to succeed.
No, thank you. The next question is from Laura in Queensland. As my grandchildren are now young drivers and others are on L plates, is the time right to warn young drivers of the risks of driving with drugs in their system, or to be aware of others who may be driving whilst they are impaired?
Absolutely. One of the very key things I was involved with both of my children when they were learning to drive was to drive for the other person. There's no good being in the right and being involved in a car crash because someone decided to break the law. You have to drive for the other person, as well as drive safely for yourself and everyone else in the community. The message is critical, and the message needs to be stated and restated. The message needs to change, and the message needs to be what I said earlier to a question Sarah Elizabeth, I think it was, mentioned in social media. It needs to be factual, because the factual messages resonate and the factual messages work. And we have to then put our faith in society that they will see the best messages, how they want to live their lives for them, their families and their children. So it's a critical point for the message to be stated and restated, and parents to state it and restate to their children from when they're at the youngest. It is a critical point in the holistic road to road safety, but also personal responsibility for drug abuse and indeed alcohol abuse.
Oh, thank you, Noel. The next question is from Marilyn in Victoria. What action will police take if they are notified of drug use, the growing of drugs in a rental property, and the importing of drugs to that rental property? Are they given they are given the evidence and the imported drugs as well? It sounds like there's a big problem there that's a current problem, no?
Well, it'd be an investigation, and the investigation would necessarily start with covert processes, and the person who has made the complaint and provided the evidence may not be told what's happening. In fact, they might even be told something quite to the contrary at that time, so as not to behave or to alert anyone. And that's quite often a normal investigative practice. But an investigation would start with some verification parts through surveillance, in certain circumstances a covert entry into the premises under warrant, and an investigation, particularly I think the word importing was mentioned. It may mean trafficking, but it certainly means the distribution of some network. There's going to be some considerable pre-investigation to get to that source. It's not a matter of grabbing the person in a property at a given point in time when you can then get the next person up the chain through some extra work. And that's something we lived and breathed in the time that I was doing covert work in the inner suburbs of Melbourne, looking for the next person up the tree, because you never know where that person leads you to. So it might even be in the interests to let that situation in the rental property run for a short time under strict surveillance and strict management in order to see where it can lead. But it would be a genuine, determined, focused investigation aiming to knock out the network who's supplying those drugs.
Oh, no, thank you. As I learn more about the fine points of your career, I'm actually thinking there's probably enough material in your background, particularly in the frightening time when you were working undercover and in those surveillance roles. I think we could probably do a Netflix series on your career.
Oh, I'm not sure. I'm not sure about that, Jan. It's been a ringside seat to the greatest show on earth, I guess.
Oh my goodness me. This question is from Geraldine here in Victoria. What are the prescription drugs which cause problems with crime and driving?
Geraldine, you may have had prescriptions in the past, and you see some various types of prescriptions, from major migraine-related tablets, etc., that can only be obtained through prescriptions, where there's warnings not to use machinery, not to use alcohol, not to drive within a period of time. Those warnings are there for a reason. So it's usually the drugs that that can be often pain management drugs, but drugs that can affect a person's motor skills, their ability to make rational, easy and simple judgments, and make judgments about distance, speed, the whole range of things that can lead to bad decisions in a motor car and death and serious injury to others. So there's a whole range of medicines, and that's quite often why these have detailed explanatory notes. And some of the explanatory notes that you see, I mean, they're too highbrow. What you really quite often need is on the label: don't drink alcohol, don't drive a car for 4 hours of having taken this drug. And it can be, as I say, for a whole range of pain management issues, or indeed, in rarer cases, mood management issues. So there's many out there that can be used, or that if are misused, can cause serious and catastrophic injury to a person.
No, the next question is from Herschel in Queensland. Mm-hmm. How can you test for impairment when there are so many variables, i.e. body weight, level of hydration, mix of drugs taken, etc., where one person, and Herschel has cited young Anna Wood, who in 1996 took an ecstasy pill and within 3 days was dead. And her friends took some and didn't have the same reaction. So us at DACA actually have quite a working knowledge about the experience of the Wood family and Anna Wood's demise. So it's interesting that people have got an awareness of that case. Because Anna's father, Tony Wood, is one of our patrons. And so we take a very big interest in this. So I'll just cover that question again for you.
Go on, please, Jan. Please,
how can you test for an impairment when there are so many variables, i.e. body weight, level of hydration, mix of drugs taken, etc., etc.? Some take one and survive, some pass just with one.
Yeah, Herschel, the physiological factors between individuals differ. Some people can consume greater quantities of alcohol, some people can have allergic to certain drugs while others aren't. The physiology differs between individuals, and individuals will react differently. In actually detecting impairment can work in a number of ways. In drugs, people can have dilated pupils, either inconsistent with one another or inconsistent with the physical environment. So in a bright light, it can be their pupils can be large, or they can be inordinately small. There's a range of subtle factors that can be observed. People can talk more quickly, talk about different subjects, ramble on, have jerky and different types of movements, and others can be completely quiet at that point in time and then governed by explosive reactions without notice. It differs to the individual. Experienced practitioners and police officers who deal with that always manage to see when someone is pilled out, as we used to say. And I remember talking to some drug-affected people on the streets of St Kilda many years ago, and I'd spoken to them several times, a time when they hadn't realised I was a police officer. And on one of them, I noticed straight away she was pilled out. Just the way she was reacting, she was outside of her normal self. And this was someone that used to provide very valuable information to police for further investigation for the distribution of drugs throughout Melbourne. So it's difficult in many ways for the individual. It's easier for the experienced, but there's also a raft of medical means that can be used to observe an individual. And for example, a driver who's caused catastrophic injury or killed someone in a crash will be observed by a forensic physician during their treatment by normal trauma physicians, if that's possible at a point in time, and make observations from a forensic perspective to draw conclusions. As well as that, of course, there's then a range of blood and other tests that occur to show the presence of substances. So, Herschel, it's not a science that can be written down, and it's governed by the physiological factors that each individual has that's independent to their own DNA and themselves.
Noel, we're getting close to time, so there are other questions, but I'm just going to have to call time on that. For those whose questions haven't been covered, we will certainly be examining those, and I want to encourage everybody to visit our website, because I want to underscore, with school starting right now in the month of February around this nation and in Queensland, a little bit delayed by a couple of weeks because of the COVID issues. We need to be mindful of the push for young children, particularly those starting secondary school for the first time, to take up vaping. It's a very dangerous pursuit. It's life-threatening. You can be dead within 2 years from the impact of vaping on your lungs. And that is a new frontier for parents and grandparents to be alert to, and siblings for their younger siblings around them. We are encouraging you to be alert for different signs, and a lot of that is available, that information is available on our website. When you visit our website, you have the opportunity to make a donation for events such as tonight's, to be aware that the fact that in short time we'll be promoting our next webinar, and also there's invaluable information for you to draw upon and refer to. It's all fully referenced and from the best scientific authorities in the world, and we pride ourselves in accessing that information and making that available. There's no exaggerations, no barrows to push. We're not looking to make money out of our activity as those who are pushing to legalise drugs.
Just let me say, Jan, just recently I read a very interesting paper. It was credentialed, well researched and credible about vaping. Now, it's not this topic I was talking about tonight, but I was surprised to learn the degree of carcinogens that occur and that are present for people that are vaping, and the impact of various cancers that can be caused. I had no idea. And so I certainly endorse that. And also in regard to the questions, just to finish me off for the night, if there's an opportunity on the website for anyone to shoot any questions through, I'd be happy to answer them in writing in due course.
Oh, that's very generous of you,
There's no
Noel.
problems with that, Jan. So any of those questions, if they would like to pop them on the website with a return email, I'll be only too happy to respond in writing.
No, thank you very much. Another thing that I'd like to underscore just before we close, ladies and gentlemen, is the fact that if you would like to provide ongoing support to DACA by becoming one of our members, one of our supporters, you can actually undertake that membership process, which is not onerous, and it's quite affordable. It's not like joining a golf club, and you can provide support to us, and we can establish wonderful, long-lasting relationships. So, just to close, I'd like to. One of the people who've messaged us tonight. I just want to encourage you to visit the website, to look to membership, to look to information, to be really wary of the trend in vaping, and consider making a donation to help us out. But this again is from Peter Richardson, who is part of the executive of our Touchstone group for grieving and aggrieved families of the drug affected. That's the unit of DACA, that's Touchstone. And Peter Richardson has given us this closing comment. Drugs are not dangerous because they're illegal. They're dangerous because they're mind-altering, and they take away judgment and empathy. And in terms of Peter's experience in his family, he knows such a lot, and the suffering is profound. Peter, thank you for that contribution for us to close on tonight. And once again, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being part of the Drug Advisory Council webinar, and there'll be another one coming to you shortly. Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you, Noel.